Marriage. It's often one of the first human interactions we are aware of as we watch our parents interact when we are young. It is the foundational unit of every culture. For Christians, marriage has special importance as an institution created by God for our good. Today, however, we see that marriage is losing its foundational place. More couples are choosing simply to live together instead of getting married. Unfortunately, divorce seems to be more common as well. And recently, the Supreme Court has redefined the concept entirely with its ruling on same-sex marriage. If marriage is indeed losing its foundational place in our society, should we not find out why and how? Because if we can, perhaps we can counteract this and restore marriage to its foundational place. But what is marriage? While the answer may seem obvious, there are actually several different views among Christians. The general breakdown is this. Catholics believe marriage is a sacrament, while Protestants believe it is a sacred and binding covenant. Now, before we begin to draw sides based on the kinds of churches we attend, I ask you to consider this. My purpose in making this distinction is never to divide or even to necessarily convert you to a different denomination, but instead to give you a fuller picture of both sacrament and covenant, that each might be understood better. There is merit to both, so I ask that you give both due consideration before you decide. Each view has its own strengths, weaknesses, and outcomes that have the power to radically alter how we as Christians understand and practice marriage, and how secular society, through our interaction with the wider world, may understand and practice it too. Now, when considering marriage, we have to first understand its history. The example of Adam and Eve in Genesis has been foundational to the Christian theology on marriage. In the New Testament, Jesus reaffirms what God intended for marriage, saying, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." He told the Pharisees that Moses originally allowed the Israelites certificates of divorce because of their hard-heartedness, but that this was never God's original intent. Also influential to the church's marriage theology were Augustine's three primary goods of marriage. 1, the procreation and nurture of children, proles. 2, the faithfulness of spouses toward one another, fides. And 3, the sacramental stability of the marital household within the city of God, sacramentum. These, along with Matthew 19, Genesis 2, and Ephesians 5, formed the basis of the church's marriage theology, and they continued to permeate Western society throughout the Middle Ages. It is in the 16th century, however, that we see a change in the definition of marriage. Martin Luther argued that it was still a good and natural thing, but that it belonged in the civil sphere. The Enlightenment brought about a further redefinition of marriage as a private bilateral contract. This is the context in which we must now understand what the definition of marriage is and what implications that holds for us as Christians today. Thus, I argue that followers of Christ should hold to a Roman Catholic understanding of marriage as a sacrament that unites a man and a woman in a metaphysical bond as a human representation of the loving relationship that exists between Christ and the church. A sacrament is a visible sign that points to an invisible reality about who Jesus is. And this sign is also literally confers grace and strength. Marriage is a sacrament since it not only mirrors the love that exists between Christ and the church, but also participates in that love. The basis for this lies especially in Ephesians 5, in which Paul compares marriage to the relationship between Christ and the church. Many Protestants would affirm that marriage is a sacred and binding covenant, that it confers no special grace, and is not meant to be a representation of any higher reality, and belongs in the civil sphere. While well-intentioned, I would argue that Luther's view of marriage in the civil sphere set the trajectory for marriage to later become merely a contract. The trajectory set by Luther's ideas about marriage being in the hands of the state has left the very definition of marriage open to interpretation, opening the door to new and alternative definitions that are not biblical, such as same-sex marriage. A Catholic definition, however, is definitive, not open to interpretation, and resistant to modern secular definitions that endanger the sanctity of marriage and the family. Now, in order to look at this further, we have to ask ourselves, what really is a sacrament? The Catholic Church teaches that the sacraments are efficacious signs of grace, instituted by Christ and entrusted to the Church, by which divine life is dispensed to us. In other words, a sacrament is a visible sign that points to a higher reality about who Jesus is or how his death on the cross allows us to receive grace. But this sign also literally confers grace and strength. A central New Testament passage that supports the sacramentality of marriage is Ephesians 5:25-33, which calls husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. Because as Paul says, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. In his book, Theology of the Body, John Paul II also argues for marriage as a sacrament. He argues that marriage reflects the reality of Christ's identity and his relationship with the church. But marriage is more than simply a sign. The exchange of wills through marriage itself also literally confers grace upon couples who participate in it, giving them the strength to more fully live out their marriage vows. While Roman Catholics and Protestants affirm nearly the same three goods as articulated by St. Augustine, the strongest distinction between the two is that Catholics believe marriage is a sacrament, while Protestants believe it is a sacred and binding covenant that does not confer any special measure of grace, nor is meant to be a sign of any higher reality. Martin Luther himself explains by saying, "Nowhere do we read in the Bible that a man who marries a wife receives any grace of God. There is not even a divinely instituted sign in marriage, nor do we read anywhere that marriage was instituted by God to be a sign of anything. To be sure, whatever takes place in a visible manner can be understood as a figure or allegory of something invisible, but figures or allegories are not sacraments in the sense in which we use the term." Now let me be clear that Luther's view of marriage in and of itself is not harmful. However, his covenant understanding did set the trajectory for marriage to later become merely a contract. Luther divided the world into two realms with his two kingdoms theology, the earthly kingdom and the heavenly kingdom. Marriage, he argued, was amongst the first created orders, and in his words, is a secular and outward thing that ought to be administered by a secular power, that is, the state. For Luther, marriage should be administered by the government, yet the church should still take an active role in exerting its influence over it out of concern for couples. But Luther, it seems, never imagined a time like ours in which the government would either disregard the church or understand marriage differently than the church. His departure from sacramentum is monumental. In removing sacramentum, Luther declares that marriage does not belong to the church, but is instead an institution of the state. Religious and legal historian John Witt argues that it is this more liberalized understanding of marriage that set the trajectory for modern society's understanding of it as a private bilateral contract that is meant to be formed, maintained, and dissolved as the couple sees fit. An understanding that I would argue, unfortunately, is responsible for rising divorce rates and marriage redefinition. Our current culture sees marriage as, well, whatever anyone wants it to be. If it's merely a contract, why can't same-sex couples enter into a marriage agreement? That is not to say that Luther's view always and necessarily leads to non-biblical interpretations of marriage, but that removing the sacramentality of marriage has left the definition of marriage open to a myriad of possible interpretations. However, a Catholic understanding of marriage relates it more fundamentally to the idea that it must be between a man and a woman exclusively for it to be considered marriage. Those who want to guard the sanctity of marriage ought to consider the benefits of a sacramental understanding. Now, some will ask, if non-believers marry, doesn't marriage have to belong in the civil sphere? Well, I would concede that to an extent it does. Marriage is more than just the bride and the groom. It extends to their families, their communities, even their future children. Marriage is not intrinsically in the civil sphere. Others will point to Mark 12:25 as evidence that it is. In Mark 12, the Sadducees ask Jesus, "If a woman marries each of 7 brothers, whose wife is she at the resurrection?" Jesus replies, "For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry, nor are they given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." This verse seems to imply that marriage is an institution of this age that will one day pass away, putting it in the civil sphere. However, I would argue that Mark 12:25 instead supports the idea that marriage now is a reflection of a greater type of marriage that is to come, the wedding of Christ and the church. The goods achieved through marriage now will later be fulfilled at the resurrection, through the wedding of Christ and his bride, the church. Therefore, marriage, in short, is not abolished in heaven, but is instead fulfilled. Thus, the fact that unbaptized couples marry is not an indication that marriage belongs intrinsically in the civil sphere. In conclusion, marriage from a Catholic perspective is the union of a man and a woman that at once symbolizes yet also participates in Christ's love. There is firm biblical evidence for this in Genesis, Matthew, and Ephesians. While some do understand marriage as a covenant, and while this view is absolutely well-intentioned, it has set the trajectory for a contractual understanding of marriage that unfortunately has caused the decline of marriage in our modern world. We see it in the smaller percentage of people that are choosing to marry, and the revolutionary redefinition of marriage that we see happening in many Western countries. Marriage is an institution created by God for our good. Is it then not worth protecting? Regardless of your denomination, I ask you to consider the benefits of a sacramental understanding and the implications it can have for healing secular society's modern view of marriage. Thank you.